May 27th, 1945. The ridgeline south of Naha. Corporal Daniel Hastings pressed himself against the muddy slope, his rifle clutched tight against his chest. Above him, somewhere in the labyrinth of caves honeycombing the coral hillside, Japanese machine gunners had pinned down his entire platoon for the better part of 3 hours. The morning had started with promise, a push toward what intelligence called a lightly defended position. That assessment had proven catastrophically wrong within the first 10 minutes. Now, as mortar rounds walked closer to his position, Hastings watched 2 soldiers hauling something he had never seen before up the slope. The weapon looked almost absurd, a long tube balanced on spindly legs, the rear end flared open like the bell of a trumpet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The man carrying it, Sergeant Robert Chen, moved with the careful confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. His partner, Private Eddie Kowalski, carried a canvas bag that clinked with each step. They set up 30 yards to Hastings' left, behind a cluster of shattered palm trees. Chen shouldered the weapon, and Kowalski fed what looked like an oversized rifle cartridge into the breech. There was a moment of stillness, almost peaceful, despite the chaos around them. Then Chen squeezed the trigger. The sound was unlike anything Hastings had heard before. Not quite a cannon, not quite a rifle, something in between. Fire erupted from both ends of the weapon simultaneously, the backblast kicking up a cloud of red Okinawan dirt. Upslope, the hillside seemed to fold in on itself. The cave entrance that had been spitting death for hours simply disappeared in a fountain of pulverized coral and smoke. The machine gun fell silent. For a heartbeat, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Then the platoon was moving, advancing past positions that minutes ago had seemed untouchable. As Hastings scrambled up the slope, he passed Chen and Kowalski, already breaking down their weapon, preparing to displace before Japanese artillery could find them. The sergeant caught his eye and grinned. "Welcome to the future, Corporal," he said. "That there is an M18, and brother, the Japanese have nothing like it." Chen was right about one thing. The weapon was revolutionary. But he was wrong about the Japanese having nothing comparable. They did have something, a German-designed Panzerfaust that had made its way into their arsenal through desperate late-war technology sharing. The problem, as Japanese commanders were learning in the bloodiest possible way, was that having a weapon and having the right weapon were 2 very different things. On paper, the Panzerfaust should have been formidable. In practice, on the killing fields of Okinawa, it was being systematically outclassed by American ingenuity in ways that revealed everything about how the Pacific War was ending. American soldiers learning to wield a weapon so new that training manuals were still being written even as they fought. And it's about Japanese defenders trying to make do with a weapon designed for European streets and forests, now pressed into service in Pacific caves and coral ridges, where its limitations became fatal liabilities. Most importantly, it's about the human beings on both sides of this equation. The engineers who solved impossible problems, the soldiers who carried these weapons into combat, the commanders who had to decide how to employ them, and the men who faced them from the other end, watching their carefully prepared defenses crumble under firepower they couldn't match and couldn't escape. To understand why the range advantage of the M18 mattered so profoundly, we need to understand the fundamental problem both sides were trying to solve and why the solutions they arrived at reflected such different military philosophies and industrial capabilities. The challenge facing infantry in World War II was as old as warfare itself. How do you destroy fortified positions without getting killed in the process? Throughout history, the answer had been some variation of overwhelming force applied from a distance. Catapults, cannons, artillery all shared the same basic principle: hit the enemy hard from far enough away that they can't hit you back. But artillery had limitations. It was heavy, cumbersome, required extensive logistical support. You couldn't take a field gun with you on patrol or into close terrain.
You certainly couldn't carry one up a steep hillside or through dense jungle. For the infantry soldier facing an enemy bunker or fortified position, the options were limited and mostly carryable. You could call for artillery support if you had radio contact and forward observers, and if the artillery was available, and if the weather allowed for accurate fire. That was a lot of ifs. You could call for air support, assuming aircraft were available and could operate in the conditions and could identify your targets without hitting friendly forces. More ifs. You could use flamethrowers, which meant getting close enough to spray burning fuel well within range of every weapon the enemy had. Or you could simply charge the position with rifle and grenade, accepting catastrophic casualties as the price of taking ground. None of these options were satisfactory. Commanders on both sides spent the entire war searching for a better answer. The Germans, characteristically, approached the problem with a focus on efficiency and mass production. They developed the Panzerfaust, which translates roughly to armor fist or tank fist, as a cheap disposable anti-tank weapon that could be produced in enormous quantities. The design was brilliantly simple. A small warhead on the end of a tube propelled by a black powder charge, fired from the shoulder and then thrown away. No complex mechanisms, no expensive machining, just point and shoot. The Panzerfaust was designed specifically for the close-quarters combat of European cities and forests. German troops facing Soviet tanks in the rubble of Stalingrad or American armor in the hedgerows of Normandy needed something they could use at close range, something simple enough that anyone could fire it, cheap enough to be issued by the thousands. For these purposes, the Panzerfaust was superb. It could penetrate the armor of any Allied tank at close range, and its simplicity meant it almost never malfunctioned. Millions were produced, and they exacted a terrible toll on Allied armor throughout the final years of the war in Europe. But the Panzerfaust had severe limitations. Its effective range was only about 30 to 60 meters, depending on the model. Beyond that distance, the slow-moving projectile became wildly inaccurate. The weapon was completely disposable. You fired it once and discarded it. There was no way to adjust aim, no sights worth mentioning, just a crude notch and post arrangement. It was a point-blank weapon designed for desperate last-ditch defense, not for mobile offensive operations or long-range engagement of fortified positions.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Positions. Japan, by 1945, was desperately seeking any technology that might help slow the American advance. Through their alliance with Germany, they had obtained examples of the Panzerfaust and had begun producing their own copies. The Japanese version was functionally identical to the German original. Same basic design, same limitations, same effective range. On paper, adding the Panzerfaust to their arsenal seemed logical. Japanese forces needed anti-tank capabilities, and the weapon was simple enough to manufacture, even as their industrial base crumbled under American bombing. What Japanese commanders failed to fully appreciate was that the Panzerfaust had been designed for a completely different type of warfare. In Europe, combat often occurred in towns and forests, where engagement ranges were measured in dozens of meters. In the Pacific, especially on islands like Okinawa, the terrain was different. Open slopes, long sight lines, defensive positions built into hillsides that could observe and engage attackers from hundreds of meters away. The Panzerfaust, optimized for close-quarters combat, was being asked to perform in an environment where close quarters were exactly what you wanted to avoid. The Americans, meanwhile, were approaching the same problem from a completely different angle. Rather than adapting an existing weapon to new circumstances, they were designing something entirely new. The genesis of what would become the M18 recoilless rifle began in 1943, when two engineers, William Kroger and William Muser, started working on a concept that seemed almost magical. What if you could eliminate recoil entirely? Not just reduce it, but actually cancel it out through clever engineering. The principle they employed was elegantly simple in theory, fiendishly complex in execution. When a conventional gun fires, the explosion that propels the projectile forward also generates recoil that pushes the weapon backward. Newton's third law in action. Heavy artillery pieces need massive carriages and sophisticated recoil systems to absorb this force. But what if, instead of absorbing the recoil,
You simply let it escape backward. If you vented the propellant gases out the back of the weapon, at the same time the projectile went forward, the two forces would cancel each other out. Recoilless weapons weren't a new concept. Various inventors had experimented with the idea dating back to the late 1800s. The Germans had fielded recoilless rifles in World War I, and several nations had toyed with the technology in the interwar years. But previous attempts had been plagued with problems. Venting gases backward meant a dangerous backblast. The venturi, the carefully shaped nozzle that directed gases backward, had to be precisely engineered, or the weapon would either not achieve recoillessness or would suffer from excessive gas loss that reduced projectile velocity. Balancing these factors while creating something that could be manufactured reliably and used safely in combat had proven extraordinarily difficult. Kroger and Muser cracked the problem through meticulous engineering and exhaustive testing. Their design used a perforated cartridge case that allowed propellant gases to flow into a chamber, then exit through a carefully designed venturi at the breech. The forward thrust of the projectile was balanced by the backward thrust of the gas jet, resulting in almost zero net recoil. The weapon could be fired from the shoulder, despite launching a 57mm artillery shell that would normally require a wheeled carriage and a crew of 4 or 5 to serve. They called their prototype the Krummasket, a playful portmanteau of their surnames. The Army, characteristically less whimsical, designated it the T-15 and began testing in late 1943. The results exceeded expectations. Here was a weapon that weighed just 44 pounds, could be carried and operated by a 2-man crew, yet fired genuine artillery shells with accuracy and range that no shoulder-fired weapon had ever achieved. By mid-1944, the T-15 had been redesignated the M18 and rushed into production. The specifications were
Impressive. The M18 fired a 57mm shell, the same caliber as many tank guns, with 4 different types of ammunition. The high-explosive anti-tank round could penetrate roughly 3 inches of armor, enough to threaten most Japanese armored vehicles. The standard high-explosive round was devastating against bunkers and fortifications. White phosphorus rounds could mark targets or flush defenders from caves with choking smoke, and practice rounds allowed crews to train without expending combat ammunition. Maximum effective range against point targets like bunkers was approximately 450 yards, with area targets engageable out to 1,300 yards or more. These weren't theoretical numbers. In the hands of trained crews, the M18 could consistently hit cave entrances and bunker apertures at ranges where defenders couldn't effectively return fire. This range advantage was the critical factor that would differentiate the M18 from the Panzerfaust on Okinawa. The Japanese weapon maxed out at perhaps 60 meters under ideal conditions, and accuracy degraded rapidly beyond 30 meters. The M18 could engage targets at 7 times that distance with precision. In practical terms, this meant M18 crews could set up well beyond the effective range of Japanese weapons, take aimed shots at defensive positions, and displace before return fire could find them. Panzerfaust operators, by contrast, had to get close, very close, exposing themselves to the full weight of American firepower just to get within range of their targets. The production figures tell their own story about American industrial capability. By early 1945, the United States had ordered over 2,000 M18 rifles and 800,000 rounds of ammunition. This was happening while American factories were simultaneously producing thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of vehicles, and millions of small arms. The same industrial base that could build a Liberty ship in weeks or turn out a bomber every hour could also tool up to mass-produce a completely new weapon system in less than 2 years from concept to deployment. Japan, by comparison, was struggling to produce even basic supplies as American submarines strangled their sea lanes and American bombers reduced their factories to rubble.
The first M18s reached Europe in March 1945, issued to airborne units and infantry divisions in the final drives into Germany. They performed well, but the European theater was already in its death throes. German resistance was collapsing, and American forces had such overwhelming firepower superiority that the M18 was just one more weapon in an already devastating arsenal. Some units experimented with the recoilless rifles, working out tactics and techniques. Others barely used them before the war ended. The real test would come in the Pacific, where the fighting was, if anything, intensifying. By spring 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most savage phase. American forces had seized Iwo Jima in February and March at horrific cost. That tiny volcanic island, just 8 square miles, had cost nearly 7,000 American dead and 20,000 wounded. The Japanese had defended it with a tenacity that bordered on the suicidal, and the battle had revealed uncomfortable truths about what an invasion of Japan itself might entail. Now came Okinawa, larger, more heavily populated, closer to Japan, and defended by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army, approximately 110,000 troops, who had turned the southern portion of the island into the most sophisticated defensive network the Japanese had yet created. Ushijima was no fool. He had studied every previous American island assault and learned their lessons.
Charging American positions was suicide. American firepower, naval gunfire, artillery, air support, tanks would annihilate any force that exposed itself. Beach defenses were pointless. Americans would simply pour overwhelming force into the landing zones, and any troops positioned there would be destroyed before they could inflict meaningful casualties. The only way to make Americans pay was to go underground, to create defensive positions so deep and so well prepared that even the most intense bombardment couldn't eliminate them. His engineers spent months transforming Okinawa's limestone ridges into fortresses. The rock was perfect for tunneling, hard enough to resist collapse, soft enough to work with the tools available. They carved networks of tunnels and caves, creating positions that were mutually supporting. Bunkers were positioned to cover the approaches to other bunkers. Artillery was placed in caves with multiple exits, allowing guns to be fired and then withdrawn before counter-battery fire could respond. Machine gun nests were sited with overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any approach to one position would be covered by fire from others. The centerpiece of this defensive system was the Shuri line, anchored on the ancient Shuri castle and extending across the island's narrow waist. Ushijima concentrated his best troops and heaviest weapons here, knowing that Americans would have to come through this killing ground to advance south. Every ridge, every hill, every draw had been incorporated into the defense. Positions had names that would become infamous: Kakuzu Ridge, the Pinnacle, Chocolate Drop Hill, each one a nightmare of interlocking fortifications that would have to be taken individually, often at tremendous cost. Into this defensive network, Japanese forces had integrated their new Panzerfausts. Thousands had been distributed to units, with instructions on their employment. The weapons were primarily intended for anti-tank use, to ambush American armor at close range when it advanced to support infantry. But they could also be used against bunkers or fortified positions if targets presented themselves. Japanese commanders, familiar with the weapon's European success, expected it to provide a significant boost to their defensive capabilities. What they hadn't fully grasped was how different the tactical environment would be. In Europe, Panzerfaust crews could hide in rubble, wait for tanks to approach within 50 meters, fire, and either flee or die in the resulting chaos. On Okinawa, the ranges were longer, the terrain more open in many areas, and the Americans were learning to keep their armor back, using it as mobile artillery rather than leading with it into ambushes. The Panzerfaust, optimized for close-range ambush, was being asked to perform in an environment where getting close enough to use it often meant exposing yourself to American fire. The American landing on April 1, 1945, was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. More than 60,000 troops hit the beaches in the first wave, expecting fierce resistance. Instead, they found almost nothing. The beaches were virtually undefended. Soldiers who had braced for a bloodbath instead advanced inland, meeting only scattered resistance. It was unsettling. Where were the Japanese? The answer became clear within days. They were waiting, dug into the hills of southern Okinawa, watching the Americans come to them. The first major clash came on April 9th, when American forces pushing south encountered the outer defenses of the Shuri Line. The landscape erupted with fire. Machine guns that had been invisible suddenly opened up from hidden positions. Mortars and artillery, pre-registered on every avenue of approach, began falling with deadly accuracy. American units that had been advancing confidently found themselves pinned down, taking casualties from an enemy they couldn't see. The easy phase of the operation was over. Now began the grinding, brutal work of reducing fortified positions one by one. This was the environment into which the M18 would be introduced, though not immediately. The first, recoilless rifles wouldn't arrive on Okinawa until late May, more than a month into the campaign. By then, American forces had learned through bitter experience just how formidable Japanese defenses were. Standard tactics, artillery preparation followed by infantry assault, were proving murderously expensive. Even when bombardment seemed to pulverize Japanese positions, defenders would emerge from deep tunnels once the barrage lifted and cut down advancing infantry. Flamethrower teams could clear caves, but getting close enough to use flamethrowers meant running a gauntlet of machine gun and rifle fire. Tank infantry teams were more effective, using armor to suppress enemy fire while infantry cleared positions. But the terrain limited where tanks could operate, and Japanese anti-tank teams, often armed with satchel charges or magnetic mines rather than Panzerfausts, exacted a steady toll on American armor. The Panzerfaust, when it was employed, was used much as it had been in Europe, as a close-range ambush weapon. Japanese troops would wait in concealed positions until American tanks approached within 50 meters or less, then fire and attempt to escape through their tunnel networks. The problem was that American tankers and infantry were learning to work together more effectively, using suppressive fire to keep Japanese heads down while armor advanced. And the open slopes of many Okinawan ridges meant that getting within Panzerfaust range often required exposing yourself to fire from multiple directions. The weapon scored kills, certainly, but not at the rate Japanese commanders had hoped. Its short range, which had been acceptable in European streets, became a critical liability in the more open terrain of Okinawa. When the first M18s arrived on Okinawa in late May, the campaign had degenerated into a nightmare of attrition. American casualties were mounting at rates that shocked commanders. The 10th Army, responsible for ground operations, was losing hundreds of men daily. Combat fatigue casualties were epidemic, with soldiers breaking under the strain of endless combat in horrific conditions. The rain had turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. Bodies, American and Japanese, lay where they had fallen, often impossible to recover under fire. The stench was overwhelming. Into this hell came the M18 crews, soldiers who had received hasty training on a weapon most had never seen before. The rifles were distributed to infantry regiments and divisions, usually in small numbers, 3 or 4 per battalion. The crews, typically consisting of a gunner, loader, and several ammunition bearers, had to learn not just how to operate the weapon, but how to employ it effectively in combat. The backblast alone required careful consideration. Fire from the wrong position, and you could injure your own troops or reveal your location to every Japanese gunner within sight. The first engagements were tentative, almost experimental. Crews would set up, engage a target, assess the results, and adjust their techniques. But word spread quickly. Here was a weapon that could reach out and touch Japanese positions from distances that kept you relatively safe, that could put artillery-grade high explosive directly onto a bunker aperture or cave entrance,
that was mobile enough to move with advancing infantry, but powerful enough to suppress even heavily fortified positions. Sergeant Robert Chen, the soldier who had so impressed Corporal Hastings on May 27th, was one of the early M18 gunners. His crew had been among the first to receive the weapon, and they had spent days working out the best ways to employ it. They learned that positioning was critical. You needed solid ground for the bipod, clear space behind for the backblast, and good observation of your target. They learned that the white phosphorus rounds were particularly effective against cave systems, the burning smoke penetrating deep into tunnels and forcing defenders either deeper underground or out into the open. They also learned, through trial and error, the best way to work with infantry. The M18 wasn't a
replacement for rifles and machine guns. It was a complement to them. Infantry would spot and mark targets, often under fire. The M18 crew would set up at a safe distance, engage the position to suppress or destroy it, then infantry would assault while the crew displaced to avoid counterfire. It required coordination and communication, but when it worked, it was devastatingly effective. Japanese defenders facing the M18 found themselves in an impossible situation. Their fortifications, which had been designed to withstand naval bombardment and aerial attack, were suddenly vulnerable to precision fire from infantry weapons. A bunker that could shrug off machine gun bullets and even small artillery rounds couldn't withstand a direct hit from a 57mm high explosive shell. The range was the killer. M18 crews could set up 400 yards away, well beyond the effective range of rifles or machine guns, certainly beyond Panzerfaust range, and methodically take apart defensive positions. For Japanese soldiers armed with Panzerfausts, the situation was particularly frustrating. They had a weapon theoretically capable of destroying American fortifications or vehicles, but they couldn't get close enough to use it without exposing themselves to fire from weapons that outranged them by an order of magnitude. The Panzerfaust had a maximum effective range of about 60 meters. The M18 could kill you from 450 meters or more. That meant M18 crews could engage Japanese positions with near impunity, while Panzerfaust teams could only watch, unable to respond. This wasn't just a technical problem, it was a psychological one. Japanese soldiers had been told that their fortifications were virtually impregnable, that their fighting spirit and superior defensive positions would allow them to exact such a terrible price that Americans would be forced to negotiate. But when your supposedly impregnable bunker can be destroyed by two soldiers with a weapon you can't even reach, that narrative collapses. The sense of invulnerability that defensive positions provided, so critical to morale when you know you're outnumbered and outgunned, evaporated under M18 fire. American soldiers conversely found their confidence growing. The M18 wasn't a miracle weapon that ended the fighting overnight, but it was a tool that made a nightmarishly difficult job somewhat more manageable. Positions that would have required calling in artillery, assuming forward observers could spot them and guns were available, could now be engaged directly by infantry units. Caves that would have needed flamethrower teams risking their lives to approach could be hit with white phosphorus rounds from a safe distance. The psychological boost of having this capability, of not feeling quite so helpless in the face of fortified positions, was incalculable. The contrast between the two weapons, the M18 and the Panzerfaust, reflected deeper differences between the American and Japanese way of war by 1945. The M18 represented American strengths, innovation, the willingness to try completely new approaches to old problems, industrial capacity, the ability to design, test, and mass-produce a sophisticated weapon system in under 2 years while simultaneously waging global war, tactical flexibility, the quick integration of new weapons into existing doctrine, and the rapid development of effective employment techniques by frontline units. The Panzerfaust, conversely, represented Japanese weaknesses by this stage of the war. It was borrowed technology, designed by someone else for someone else's war. It was a good weapon for what it was designed for, but Japanese forces were trying to use it in circumstances it wasn't suited for, and critically, Japan lacked the industrial capacity or time to develop better alternatives. They were making do with what they could get,
adapting foreign designs, stretching limited resources, trying to hold back a tide with inadequate tools. This wasn't to say that Japanese soldiers were incompetent or that the Panzerfaust was useless. Japanese defenders on Okinawa fought with skill,
Courage, and often shocking effectiveness. The Panzerfaust stored kills when it could be employed under the right circumstances, but the systemic advantages lay entirely with the Americans, and weapons like the M18 exemplified that advantage. It wasn't just that the M18 was better than the Panzerfaust in some abstract sense. It was that the M18 was specifically suited to the type of warfare being waged on Okinawa, while the Panzerfaust was not. As May turned to June and the campaign ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the M18's presence on the battlefield grew. More weapons arrived, more crews were trained, and the tactical doctrine for their employment became more sophisticated. Units began using M18s in coordinated attacks with multiple weapons engaging different aspects of a defensive position simultaneously. Some crews specialized in bunker busting, others in cave clearing with white phosphorus. The weapon became integrated into standard American tactics, one more tool in an increasingly effective toolkit. For Japanese forces, the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign were an exercise in futility and horror. The Shuri line, which was supposed to hold for months, was progressively dismantled. American firepower, including but not limited to the M18, simply ground down defensive positions one by one. Japanese casualties mounted catastrophically with no hope of reinforcement or resupply. The 32nd Army was dying in its caves and bunkers, taking as many Americans with them as possible, but achieving nothing strategically. The Panzerfausts, distributed with such hope just months earlier, proved largely ineffective in the final analysis. Some were used, some scored kills, but the weapon never became the force multiplier Japanese commanders had hoped for. Its short range, which had seemed acceptable when the weapons were requisitioned, became a fatal flaw in the actual combat environment. Japanese soldiers armed with Panzerfausts often died before they could get close enough to use them, cut down by American fire at ranges their weapons couldn't match. The M18, meanwhile, continued to prove its worth right up to the campaign's bitter end. On June 21st, as organized Japanese resistance was finally collapsing, M18 crews were still engaging the last holdout positions, methodically clearing caves and bunkers in the southern tip of the island. The weapon that had arrived so late in the campaign had become indispensable to the soldiers who used it. It had saved lives, American lives, by allowing infantry to engage fortified positions without having to close to suicidal ranges. The numbers were stark and terrible. American casualties on Okinawa totaled approximately 49,000, including over 12,000 dead. These figures represented roughly 35% of the assault force, a casualty rate higher than most battles in the European theater. Japanese losses were catastrophic, approximately 110,000 killed, an almost complete annihilation of the defending force. And perhaps most tragic, Okinawan civilian casualties numbered between 100,000 and 150,000, innocent people caught in a battle they had no part in starting and no ability to escape. The horror of Okinawa influenced every subsequent decision about how to end the Pacific War. The brutality of the fighting, the refusal of Japanese forces to surrender, the staggering casualty rates on all sides convinced American planners that an invasion of Japan's home islands would be catastrophic beyond imagining. The planned Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties in just the first phase. What casualties the Japanese would suffer, military and civilian, was almost unthinkable. It was against this backdrop that the decision to employ atomic weapons against Japan was made. The debate over that decision continues to this day and likely always will, but what's undeniable is that Okinawa shaped American thinking about what invading Japan would entail. The battle demonstrated that Japanese forces would fight to the last man, that civilians would be drawn into the combat, that every square mile would be purchased with blood. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet declaration of war, ended the conflict before that apocalyptic invasion became necessary. But our focus here is narrower and in some ways more revealing. The story of the M18 and the Panzerfaust on Okinawa tells us something important about how wars are won and lost. It's not just about having weapons, it's about having the right weapons for the right circumstances, employed by soldiers who understand how to use them effectively. The technical specifications matter, but they matter less than how those specifications translate into tactical advantage on actual battlefields. The M18's range advantage over the Panzerfaust wasn't just a number on a chart. It was the difference between being able to engage enemy positions safely and having to expose yourself to enemy fire just to get within range. In a battle where survival often came down to who could kill whom first from the greatest distance, that mattered enormously. Japanese soldiers with Panzerfaust were brave, skilled, and determined. But bravery and skill couldn't overcome the simple fact that their weapons couldn't reach American positions that American weapons could easily engage. Consider the geometry of the battlefield. An M18 crew sets up 400 yards from a Japanese bunker. They're behind cover, positioned so the backblast won't injure friendly forces, with good observation of their target. They can take their time, aim carefully, fire when ready. The Japanese defenders in that bunker can see the Americans, might even be able to hit them with rifle fire if they're lucky, but they have no weapon that can meaningfully threaten the M18 position. A Panzerfaust at 400 yards might as well be on another planet for all the good it does. Now imagine the reverse scenario. A Japanese soldier with a Panzerfaust wants to engage an American position. To have any chance of hitting, he needs to get within 60 meters, ideally closer. That means crossing 350 yards of open ground, under observation, under fire, to reach a range where his weapon becomes effective. Even if he makes it, which is unlikely, he gets one shot. The Panzerfaust is single use. Miss, and you're standing in the open with an empty tube and enemy soldiers who now know exactly where you are. The tactical calculus is brutal and unforgiving. This range differential wasn't an accident. It reflected fundamental differences in design philosophy and intended employment. The Panzerfaust was designed as a defensive weapon for close-quarters combat. It assumed that you would be fighting from prepared positions in urban terrain or forests, where enemies would have to come close to you. In that context, short range was acceptable because engagement ranges were naturally short. The weapon's simplicity and disposability were features, not bugs. You needed something cheap enough to issue by the thousands, simple enough that anyone could use it with minimal training. The M18, conversely, was designed for offensive operations by highly mobile forces. American doctrine emphasized maneuver and the ability to bring firepower to bear quickly at various ranges. The weapon needed to be portable enough for infantry to carry, but powerful enough to engage fortified positions. It needed range because American tactics relied on suppressing enemy positions from a distance while infantry maneuvered to assault. And it needed to be reusable because American logistics could support sophisticated weapons that required maintenance and resupply. These different design philosophies reflected different military realities. Germany in 1944, designing the Panzerfaust, was on the defensive, facing enemies on all fronts, desperately trying to slow the inevitable. They needed cheap, effective weapons in enormous quantities. Simplicity was paramount because their industrial base was being destroyed and their skilled workforce was depleted. The Panzerfaust fit these requirements perfectly. It was a brilliant solution to Germany's specific problems. The M18, on the other hand, reflected the maturity and strength of the American industrial base. With a huge base of manufacturing capabilities and a deep talent pool, the U.S. could afford to design and produce sophisticated weapons like the M18. The M18 was an object lesson in what could be achieved when industrial capacity was combined with sound tactical doctrine. Japan, adopting the Panzerfaust in 1945, was in a similar strategic position, but a different tactical environment. They were also on the defensive, also facing inevitable defeat, also desperately needing weapons. The Panzerfaust seemed like a logical choice.
Germany had used it successfully. It was relatively simple to manufacture. It provided infantry with anti-tank and anti-fortification capability. But what worked in European cities didn't necessarily translate to Pacific Islands. And Japanese commanders learned this lesson at terrible cost. The United States, developing the M18, was operating from a position of strength. They could afford to design sophisticated weapons that required precision manufacturing. They had the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful quantities. They had the logistical infrastructure to get them to frontline units with ammunition and spare parts. And critically, they had the time and resources to develop proper tactics for their employment. The M18 wasn't just a better weapon in some abstract sense. It was a weapon that matched American capabilities and tactical requirements. When we talk about the M18 outranging the Panzerfaust, we're really talking about these larger issues. Range is just one specification, but it reveals everything about the different contexts in which these weapons were created and employed. The M18 represented American ability to innovate, produce, and adapt. The Panzerfaust, in Japanese hands, represented the desperation of trying to fight an opponent with overwhelming material advantages using borrowed tools designed for someone else's war. The human element of this story deserves emphasis. Engineers William Kroger and William Muser, working in American laboratories in 1943, had no way of knowing their creation would face off against German Panzerfausts in Japanese hands on Okinawan ridges. They were just trying to solve a problem: how to give infantry more firepower. The fact that their solution proved so effective wasn't inevitable. It required thousands of hours of work, countless tests, numerous failures and refinements. It required factory workers who machined the parts, logistics personnel who shipped the weapons, and training instructors who taught soldiers how to use them. Similarly, the Japanese soldiers issued Panzerfausts weren't fools or incompetents. They were men trying to defend their positions with the tools available to them. Many had been conscripted, pulled from civilian life, and given minimum training before being thrown into combat. They were told the Panzerfaust was a powerful weapon that would help them stop American tanks and suppress enemy positions. They weren't told, because their commanders didn't fully understand, that the weapon's short range would make it nearly useless in the specific circumstances of Okinawan combat. And the American soldiers, the Sergeant Chens and Private Kowalskis who actually carried the M18 into combat, they were just trying to survive and accomplish their missions. Most had no idea they were carrying a revolutionary weapon. They just knew it was heavy, complicated, dangerous to use incorrectly, and remarkably effective when employed properly. They learned through experience, made mistakes, adapted, and slowly developed the expertise that made the weapon so devastating. This brings us to the edge of our story's transition point. We've established what the weapons were, where they came from, why they were designed the way they were. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.